The day Louise Hurst threw a grown man's saddlebag off her front porch and told him he could follow it or sleep in the street was the day everyone in Caldwell, Kansas decided she was not a woman to be trifled with. And for 6 years that reputation had kept her boarding house full of paying tenants and her heart empty of everything else. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead on a string, dusty and restless, and loud with the commerce of cattle and men who smelled like cattle. The town had grown faster than its manners, with saloons outnumbering churches 4-1, and the railroad having arrived only a handful of years prior, bringing with it a particular breed of transient soul who needed a bed and a hot meal, and a place to hang his hat without anyone asking too many questions. Louise Hurst provided exactly that at fair prices, with clean linens changed every Thursday, and with a set of house rules posted on a painted board beside the front door that left absolutely nothing to interpretation. No liquor on the premises, no women of questionable virtue in the rooms, no gambling, no tobacco indoors. Meals served at 6 in the morning, noon sharp, and 7 in the evening. If you missed a meal, you missed it. Rent due every Sunday before the church bell stopped ringing. If you broke a rule, your belongings would be waiting on the porch before you could argue the matter. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned so severely it might have given another woman a headache, and brown eyes that missed nothing. She had come to Caldwell 7 years ago as the wife of Daniel Hurst, a man who had genuinely loved her and who had been genuinely unlucky, taken by a fever in the winter of 1876, before they had managed to build anything more than the bones of a life together. The boarding house had been Daniel's idea, and Louise had built it into something real after he was gone, pouring every grief she owned into the plaster and the woodwork and the running of it, until the house became the thing she was instead of a thing she merely did. She was not unkind. That was the part people misunderstood. She kept a garden behind the house that nobody ever saw unless they happened to glance from an upstairs window, full of tomatoes and marigolds, and a rose bush she tended with the same concentration a surgeon brings to difficult work. When old Pete Galveston had taken ill in the second room 2 winters ago, she had sat with him through 3 consecutive nights, changing his compresses and reading to him from a book of Psalms he kept under his pillow, and she had done it without once being asked, and without once mentioning it afterward. She simply did not let people see the soft machinery of her, because in her experience, every time she had shown it, someone had found a way to use it against her. Frank Trask arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of April with a single leather bag, a gray horse named after nobody in particular, and a quiet that settled around him like dust after a long ride. He was 34 years old, lean through the shoulders in the way of a man who had worked hard all his life rather than growing heavy from inactivity, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had the particular quality of stillness you find in deep water calm on the surface, but suggesting considerable depth beneath. He had come from Dodge City, or so he said, though he did not elaborate and Louise did not press, because she had learned that a man's history was his own business until it made itself her business. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hand, which she noticed immediately because a fair number of men came to her door and did not bother with that particular courtesy, and he read the rules board from top to bottom before he knocked. That, too, she noticed. "Room available?" he asked when she opened the door. "Depends on the tenant," she said. It was what she always said. "I am steady," he said. "I pay what I owe. I do not make noise after 9 in the evening, and I have never in my life touched another man's property without permission." She studied him for a moment with those brown eyes that had been known to make dishonest men look at their boots. He looked back at her without flinching, which was also notable. $2 a week, she said. "Meals included. Rules are on the board and I expect you have read them." "I have," he said. "Room 3 is at the top of the stairs on the left. There is a wash basin and a pitcher. Hot water is available in the kitchen between 5:30 and 7 in the morning and again from 4 to 5 in the afternoon. If you need it outside those hours, you heat it yourself on the kitchen stove and you clean up after yourself. That is fair, he said, and she handed him a key, and that was how Frank Trask came to live at the Hurst boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas. The first week, he gave her no trouble at all. He was up before she rang the breakfast bell. He ate without complaint and complimented the biscuits on the third morning in a straightforward manner that was neither flattery nor conversation-making. He carried his own dishes to the kitchen sink, and he was never once heard after 9 at night. He worked, she did not know exactly what he did, but he rode out each morning and came back each evening with the look of a man who had done something purposeful with his day. She learned later, through the general intelligence network of a small western town, that he had hired on with a surveying outfit working out of the county seat, marking land parcels for the railroad's continued expansion south. The other boarders were a mixed collection, as they always were. There was Ernest Poole, a portly man of 50 who ran the dry goods store on the main street and who had been a boarder for 3 years because his wife had gone back east to care for her mother, and found that she preferred the east. There was Cal Whitmore, a young cowboy of 22 who worked the cattle runs in season and played cards at the Lucky Star Saloon on evenings off, which Louise tolerated because he was careful to leave his winnings and his losses and his whiskey smell outside her door. And there was Margaret Denny, a widow of 48 who worked as a seamstress, and who was the only woman boarder Louise had ever kept because Margaret was tidy and self-contained and paid 3 days early every week without exception. Dinner on Frank's 8th evening in residence was the first time anything like a conversation developed between them. The others had finished and drifted off to their various evening occupations, and Frank had stayed to help clear the table, which he did without making a show of it, just picking up plates with the ease of someone accustomed to doing useful things. "You do not have to do that," Louise said. "I know it," he replied, setting the stack of plates beside the sink. He turned and looked at her kitchen with what she could only describe as appreciation, not the appraising look of a man calculating value, but the genuine recognition of a well-organized space. "You run a good house, Mrs. Hurst." "I run a profitable house," she said, which was not quite the same thing, and she said it because she had long ago decided it was safer to accept practical compliments than sentimental ones. He seemed to understand the distinction. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said mildly. "No," she agreed, "they are not." He said good night and went upstairs, and Louise stood in her kitchen for a moment longer than was necessary, listening to his footsteps cross the ceiling above her. By the end of April, she had gathered enough about Frank Trask to form an incomplete picture, which was more than she usually permitted herself to form of any tenant. He was from Missouri originally, from a farm family that had scattered after the war. He said this once briefly, in response to a direct question from Ernest Poole at the supper table, and did not embellish. He had worked in several capacities across the Western territories in the intervening years, including a stint as a deputy sheriff in a town in Colorado whose name Louise did not catch. And now he was doing survey work, which he seemed to find genuinely interesting in the way a man finds interesting the thing he is good at. He read in the evenings. She knew this because she could sometimes see the light under his door when she passed in the hall, and he had a small collection of books in his room that she noticed when she went to change his linens on Thursday, which was her policy regardless of whether the tenant was present. He had left his room in a state of perfect order. The books were lined up on the windowsill with the spines facing out. There was a photograph on the small dresser in a leather frame of a woman and a boy, and Louise looked at it longer than she should have before she reminded herself that it was none of her business. She changed the linens and left. That evening at supper, she told herself she was not going to mention the photograph, and she did not, and she was proud of herself for this restraint until Cal Whitmore, who had the particular gift of young men for asking exactly the questions that older, wiser people have agreed not to ask, leaned across the table and said to Frank, "You got family somewhere, Trask." There was a half-second pause that Louise felt in her chest. "Had a brother," Frank said. His voice was even. "He passed some years back. Photograph on my dresser is him and his boy. The boy's with my sister-in-law's people up in Nebraska now. Doing all right, last I heard." "Sorry to hear it," Cal said, and went back to his potatoes with the easy recovery of youth. Louise kept her eyes on her own plate. She thought about her garden, and about the way loss had a texture that changed over time but never quite became something else. May brought the heat early, and with it, the first real test of Louise Hurst's composure where Frank Trask was concerned. There was a man named Garrett Sully who had been trying to buy the boarding house for 2 years. Sully owned the Lucky Star Saloon and 3 other properties on the main street, and he was the kind of man who believed that anything a woman could be made to sell could be made to sell, given sufficient pressure. He came around on a Tuesday morning when Louise was hanging wash on the line behind the house, which meant she was near her garden, which meant she was in the one place she felt most purely herself, and his arrival there felt like a particular sort of violation. "Mrs. Hurst," he said, coming around the corner of the house with his hat tipped and his smile arranged the way a man arranges furniture he does not actually like. "Beautiful morning." "It is," she said, and kept pinning the sheet. "Thought any more about my offer?" "I think about my offer the way I think about February weather in July," she said. "Not relevant to present conditions." Sully's smile thinned. He was a big man, not physically threatening in any immediate sense, but with the kind of easy confidence that comes from having money and the willingness to use it carelessly. "The offer's gone up since February," he said. "Another $200. That's a fair sum for a place this size." "What I have built is not for sale," she said. She turned to look at him directly then, because she had found that men like Sully sometimes needed to see the fullness of her before they believed she meant what she said. "If I say that again in your hearing, it will be because you have come here again uninvited, and at that point I will be saying it to Sheriff Alcott instead of to you." Sully held her gaze for a moment, then let it go. "Woman running a place alone," he said, almost to himself, with a shake of his head that contained multitudes of condescension. "Shame not to have someone to help you manage." "I manage fine," she said. He went. She went back to her wash. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not know Frank had been in the kitchen until she came inside and found him at the back window, which faced the yard, a cup of coffee in his hand. He had clearly heard the exchange. He did not say anything immediately. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table, which she understood was not an imposition but an offer. She sat down and picked it up. "He has been at this before?" Frank asked. 2 years, she said. "He started the month after I finished paying the mortgage." "A coincidence, most likely," Frank said, with dry irony that she appreciated. "Most likely," she agreed. "You handled him well." "I always handle him well," she said. "It does not appear to discourage him." Frank looked at his coffee. "There are men," he said slowly, "who interpret a woman's competence as an obstacle rather than a conclusion. They believe the obstacle can be removed with enough persistence." "Yes," she said, "there are. You should know," he said carefully, looking up at her, "that if he ever makes trouble of a more physical variety, I am good for it." Louise looked at him. In another man's mouth, that sentence might have been an attempt to position himself as something she needed, which was a transaction she had no interest in. In Frank's mouth, it landed differently, not like a claim but like a fact he was making available, the way you might point out that there is a spare lamp in the cupboard in case the other one goes out. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and she drank her coffee. Garrett Sully did not come back for 3 weeks. When he came back in June, it was not to the house but to the dry goods store where Louise was collecting a list of supplies, and he was with 2 men she did not recognize, which changed the texture of the encounter considerably. He did not touch her, did not threaten her in any explicit way, but he stood too close and spoke too quietly, and used the word alone twice in the space of a single sentence. And Louise drove her wagon home with her jaw set, and her mind working at the problem with methodical determination. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table after supper and wrote out a letter to Sheriff Alcott describing the encounter in careful, specific language that left nothing open to interpretation. She was not a woman who made dramatic gestures or issued empty ultimatums, but she was also not a woman who waited for trouble to come fully formed when she could intercept it at the threshold. Frank knocked on the kitchen doorframe at 8:30. The kitchen was her domain and everyone in the house knew it, which meant they knocked and she told him to come in. He looked at the letter. He did not read it. "You are writing to Alcott," he said. "I am." "Good," he said simply. Then he surprised her. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which none of her tenants ever did without invitation, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been trying not to think about too carefully for the past several weeks, and he said, "Tell me about the house, how you built it." It was such an unexpected turn that she almost laughed. She did not laugh, she had not laughed freely in a long time, she had noticed, but the near laugh did something to her face because he saw it and something in his own expression shifted, like a window opening. So she told him. She told him about coming to Caldwell with Daniel in 1875, about Daniel's plan and his good heart and his bad luck, about the fever that had taken him in December of 1876 when the snow was 2 feet deep on the plains, and the nearest doctor was in Wellington, 20 miles south. She told him about taking stock of what was left, the house, half furnished and not yet earning a modest sum in the bank, and her own 2 hands, and deciding that grief was a luxury she could afford only in the evenings after the work was done. She told him about the first year, when she had 3 boarders and barely enough coming in to cover costs, and the second year, when she had expanded to 6 rooms by turning the large attic into a proper bedroom, and the third year, when the reputation of her cooking and her clean linens had made the Hurst boarding house the preferred accommodation in Caldwell for any man who intended to stay more than a week. Frank listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the night sounds of the Kansas plain coming through the screen crickets and the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional voice from the direction of the main street. "Daniel was a lucky man," Frank said, "before the luck ran out." "He was a good man," Louise said. "That is different." "It is," he agreed. "And you are a remarkable woman, I expect you know that." She looked at him steadily. "I know I am capable," she said. "Remarkable is a word people use when they are surprised by something, and I have stopped being surprised by myself." He thought about that. "Fair enough," he said, with a small, genuine smile that was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it did something unexpected to her chest, a kind of pressure that was neither painful nor comfortable but was very definitely present. She looked down at her letter. "Good night, Mr. Trask," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Hurst," he said, and he got up and went upstairs, and she sat for a moment with her hand flat on the table before she finished the letter to Sheriff Alcott. The sheriff, to his credit, paid Sully a visit the following morning. Sully was not prosecuted for anything because he had been careful not to do anything prosecutable, but the visit had the effect of making him less visible for the remainder of the summer, which was all Louise had asked for and all she expected from it. June deepened into July, and July into August, and the heat on the Kansas plain became a physical thing you negotiated rather than ignored, and the boarding house moved through it the way Louise moved through everything, with competence and without complaint. The cattle drives were through their peak season by July, and Caldwell's Main Street was thick with trail hands and buyers, and the commerce that followed them, and Louise kept her house full, and her rules enforced and her expression composed. But things were shifting inside her, quietly and without her full permission. She knew the exact moment she understood that she was in trouble where Frank Trask was concerned. It was the second Thursday of July, and she was changing the linens in his room while he was out on the survey, and she found a book left open on the nightstand. It was a copy of Tennyson's poems, borrowed, she could see the stamp inside the cover, from the small lending library that the Methodist Church ran out of a back room. It was open to a poem called Crossing the Bar, and he had written nothing in the margins. He was clearly not a man who wrote in borrowed books, but there was a piece of folded paper tucked between the pages as a marker, and when she moved it to straighten the book, a line from the poem was exposed and she read it before she meant to. I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. She stood in the hot, still room with the summer light coming through the curtain and the clean-sheet smell of the linens in her arms, and she thought about Frank Trask sitting up at night with a lamp and a borrowed book of poems, alone in this room that she had furnished and that she kept clean, and she felt something she had not felt since before Daniel died, a tenderness so sharp it was nearly intolerable. She put the book back exactly as she had found it, made the bed with precise hospital corners, and went downstairs. That evening at supper she was, by her own assessment, perfectly normal. She served the food. She answered Ernest Poole's question about whether the hardware store had gotten in new hinges. She told Cal Whitmore that if he was going to be later than midnight he needed to oil the front door because she had been woken twice by the squeak of it, and she did not look at Frank Trask any more than she looked at the others. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room at every moment. After supper, he found her in the garden. This was unprecedented. Nobody came to the garden. It was behind the house and not visible from the street, and the tenants, by some unspoken understanding, had always treated it as off-limits. She was on her knees in the dirt, doing the detailed work of tending that a garden in August required, pulling runners, checking for the beetles that liked to get at the tomato leaves, pressing the earth around the base of the rose bush that was, despite the heat, producing a second flush of small red blooms. She heard his step on the dry grass behind her and she turned, and there he was, hat in hand again, as if he were arriving somewhere for the first time. "I saw you come out here," he said. "I have been curious about this garden since the first week. Most people are not curious about it at all," she said. "I'm not most people," he said, which was so matter-of-fact and so accurate that she did not argue it. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. In the garden, in the evening light, with her hair slightly loosened from the day's work and dirt on her hands, she was aware of being entirely herself in a way she was not always aware of when she was running the house, more exposed somehow, and strangely less uncomfortable with it than she expected to be. He looked at the rose bush. "You planted this," he said. "It was not a question. The year after Daniel died," she said. "It is the variety my mother grew. I brought a cutting from the farm when we came west." He was quiet for a moment. "It is a good garden," he said, "practical and lovely at once." She looked at him. He looked back. The evening was very quiet except for the insects and the distant town sounds, and the light was going golden the way Kansas light does in August, turning everything it touches a little more beautiful than it actually is. "Why did you come back here?" she asked. She meant to Caldwell, to the survey work, to this part of the territory, but she was also asking something else, and she suspected he knew it. "I needed somewhere that felt like it was worth staying in," he said. "I have been moving a long time. I am getting to an age where moving for its own sake loses its appeal." "Caldwell is not a beautiful town," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the people in it can be." His eyes were on her face when he said it, and she held his gaze and did not look away, though her heart was doing something complicated against her ribs. "Mr. Trask," she said carefully. "Frank," he said, "if you are comfortable with it." She considered this. "Frank," she said. It felt different in her mouth than she expected. "I am not a woman who does things carelessly." "I know that," he said. "It is one of the things I respect most about you." "I have run this house alone for 6 years," she said, "and I have done it well, and I have no intention of making decisions that complicate that." "I'm not asking you to make any decisions," he said. "I am standing in your garden telling you that I think you are remarkable, in the specific sense of the word, not because I am surprised by you, but because something about you requires remarking on, and I find I cannot stop remarking on it internally. So I thought I might say it out loud once, and then I will not trouble you with it further if you prefer." She stood very still. The rose bush was behind her, and the last light was in his gray eyes, and she thought about Daniel, briefly and without guilt, and about the 6 years she had spent converting grief into function, and she thought about what it might mean to let something in again. "I do not prefer that," she said at last. "I prefer you say it when you mean it and say nothing when you do not." He nodded slowly, as if this were an agreement being drawn up in careful language and he wanted to be sure of the terms. "I can do that," he said. "Good," she said. "Now let me finish with the tomatoes." He did not leave. He crouched down across the row from her and began, with evident competence, checking the other side of the plants for beetles. She watched him do this for a moment, the easy, unself-conscious way he moved through a domestic task that had nothing to do with him, and she turned back to her own work and felt, for the first time in 6 years, the distinct and terrifying sensation of something opening in her chest that she had long believed was permanently sealed. They worked in the garden until the light was fully gone. They did not speak much. They did not need to. August brought a complication in the form of a man named Dix Colburn, who arrived at the boarding house looking for a room, and whom Louise turned away on the basis of a gut feeling that she had learned over years of running the house to trust absolutely. Colburn was not visibly disreputable. He was clean and his money was real. But he had the particular quality of watching that made her skin feel observed in an unpleasant way, and she told him she had no vacancies, which was not technically true, but which she defended privately on the grounds that vacancy was a relative concept. Colburn turned out to be a man with connections to a stock theft operation that Sheriff Alcott had been trying to track for several months. This became public knowledge 2 weeks after Louise turned him away, when Alcott arrested him in the alley behind the Lucky Star. The town talked about it considerably, and several people told Louise she had been fortunate, and she thanked them calmly and thought privately that fortune had had very little to do with it. Frank heard about it at supper through Cal Whitmore, who had all the town gossip by a kind of osmosis, and he looked at Louise across the table with an expression of such clear and uncomplicated admiration that she had to look down at her plate. "How did you know?" Cal asked her. "Practice," she said, "and attention." Frank said nothing, but when he caught her eye later, passing in the hallway, there was something warm in his expression that she carried with her for the rest of the evening. The summer courtship, if it could be called that, which Louise resisted calling it for some time, was the quietest and most careful thing she had experienced since Daniel. Frank did not make declarations or press his case or maneuver her into corners. He was simply and consistently present in a way that was different from merely occupying the same house. He remembered things she mentioned once and never repeated, and he acted on them in undemonstrative ways, bringing a newspaper from the reading room when she mentioned wanting to follow a story, or adjusting the parlor lamp she had struggled with silently for 3 days without saying anything, fixing the mechanism with a screwdriver and leaving it without comment. He also, gradually and without ceremony, became someone she talked to. Not about the house. She had always been able to discuss the house. It was a safe and practical subject, but about other things. About Missouri and her childhood there, which had been ordinary and plain and full of the specific happiness of people who do not have enough to be dissatisfied with. About what the West had been when she arrived versus what it was becoming, the railroad and the barbed wire and the slow conclusion of the open range. About books, which she read when the house was quiet at night, and which she had never had anyone to discuss because her tenants, with the exception of Margaret Denny, were not readers. Frank was a reader. He returned the Tennyson to the Methodist library and came back with a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he lent to Louise without making much of it, and she read it in the evenings and found herself wanting to discuss it with him, which she did, and which became a habit, the two of them at the kitchen table after supper several evenings a week. the book between them and the coffee growing cold as they argued amicably about the characters. "She makes a terrible choice," Louise said of Dorothea with some feeling. "She makes a human choice," Frank said, "which is sometimes terrible. She should have known better. She knew what she knew," he said, "which was not enough at the time." "As it generally is not at the time." Louise looked at him. "You have more charity for foolishness than I do." "I have made more of it," he said simply. "It changes your perspective." She wanted to ask what foolishness specifically, but she did not, because she had her own policy on such things. A person's history was their own until it made itself relevant, and she kept to her own rules. He told her anyway, eventually. Not all at once, but in the way that trust is built, in installments over time. He had been engaged once in Colorado to a woman who had ultimately chosen a man with more certainty about his future than Frank had been able to offer at the time. He did not speak of her with bitterness or with excessive feeling, only with the kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of a thing that had been real and had become past. "I was not ready to be what she needed," he said. "That is the sum of it. Nobody was wrong." "That is a generous reading," Louise said. "It is the accurate one," he said. "I have had time to look at it clearly." In September, Garrett Sully made another move, and this one was uglier. He found out, through whatever sources he had in the town, that Louise's property tax assessment had been formally appealed by a neighboring landowner who claimed a boundary dispute with the boarding house lot. The appeal was, as best Louise could determine after a hard afternoon with the county records, entirely fabricated, a piece of paper filed by a man who appeared to be doing Sully's work for money. But it was enough to cloud the title and create a period of legal uncertainty that would, in theory, make it very difficult for her to operate. Louise sat with this for one evening. She let herself feel the full weight of it, the anger and the specific exhaustion of being a woman alone in a situation that men had engineered for their own convenience. And then she put it down and began to solve it. She went to the land office the following morning and requested every document relevant to her property. She spent 3 days cross-referencing them with a patience that surprised even herself. She found what she needed, a surveyor's plat from 1874 that established the boundary lines unambiguously and in terms that no reasonable reading could dispute. She also asked Frank, not because she needed him to solve it, she was already solving it, but because he was a surveyor, and because she trusted his eyes, and because asking him felt different now than asking a stranger would have felt. It felt like what it was, asking someone she was beginning to rely on, carefully and in specific ways, which was not the same as needing him, but which was not nothing. He looked at the plat and the disputed documents for less than 20 minutes. "This is fraudulent," he said calmly. "The boundary Sully's man is claiming does not correspond to any original survey of this territory. I can write a statement to that effect as a licensed surveyor of record, and it will carry legal weight." "I would be grateful for that," she said. He wrote the statement that afternoon, on his own time, in his careful hand, with the precision and detail of a professional document. He gave it to her without ceremony. She took it to the land office, and the appeal was dismissed within the week. Sully was furious, in the particular contained way of men who are used to getting what they want and find themselves unexpectedly checked. He made no further direct approaches, but Louise heard through the town's intelligence that he had made some remarks in the Lucky Star about her that were not complimentary. She heard this through Cal Whitmore, who reported it at supper with the righteous indignation of youth. "What did he say?" Frank asked, his voice very level. Cal glanced at Louise. "That she, well, that the place would be better managed by someone with more business sense and less personal stubbornness." There was a silence. "He used the word stubborn?" Louise asked. "Among others," Cal said. "What others?" Frank asked. "Frank," Louise said. He looked at her. His jaw was set, and she recognized in him something she had seen in other men, but that in him had a different quality, not the desire for violence but the specific anger of a man who respects a woman and finds her being disrespected, which is a real and separate thing. "Let it alone," she said quietly. "He wants a reaction. I will not give him one, and I will not have anyone giving him one on my behalf." Frank held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded. After supper in the kitchen, he said, "You could let someone fight that battle." "I do not need a battle fought," she said. "I need him to become irrelevant, which he will if I do not give him the attention he is looking for." "You are probably right," he said. "I am right," she said without heat. "I have been right about Garrett Sully for 2 years." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "you have." October came with its full and particular beauty. The Kansas sky enormous and blue above the brown plain, the mornings cold enough for a fire in the parlor, the evenings smelling of wood smoke and turned earth. Louise brought in her garden for the season, laying up the last of the tomatoes in the root cellar and cutting the rose bush back for winter, and the act of it had its usual quality of both ending and preparation, the sense that things were being made ready for what came next. She was increasingly aware of what might be coming next. The tenants shifted, as they did in autumn. Cal Whitmore went south with a cattle outfit heading for the Texas ranges for the winter season, leaving his room vacant after a cheerful farewell involving the gift of a pair of spurs to Ernest Poole that confused everyone, including Ernest Poole. A new tenant came in, a school teacher named Harrison who kept to himself admirably and who turned out to be an excellent checker player, which mattered to Ernest Poole considerably. Frank's survey work slowed with the season but did not stop. The railroad's appetite for land was not seasonal. He was in town more, and in the house more, and Louise was in the house more as well, and the house was at once very large and not quite large enough. She had a conversation with Margaret Denny in early October that she had not planned, and that she thought about for a long time afterward. Margaret was a woman of considerable perception behind her quiet manner, and she said to Louise one afternoon, while they were both sitting in the parlor after dinner with their respective work, "He is a good man, that Trask." "He is a reliable tenant," Louise said, without looking up from her mending. "Louise," Margaret said gently. Louise looked up. "He looks at you," Margaret said, "the way Daniel used to look at you. I do not say that to cause you pain. I say it because I think you should know it, and I think you are probably telling yourself something other than the truth." Louise was quiet for a moment. "I run this house," she said. "You do," Margaret said. "No one disputes that. Running a house and having a life are not mutually exclusive, though. You said as much to me once when I was grieving Thomas and thinking I ought to close myself up entirely." Louise remembered the conversation. She had meant what she said. She had not, apparently, applied it to herself. "He has not said anything particular," she told Margaret. "No," Margaret agreed. "He is waiting." "For what?" "For you to be ready," Margaret said simply and went back to her stitching. Louise sat with her mending in her hands and did not make a stitch for 10 minutes. She thought about it for the better part of a week, not obsessively, not in the way of a woman manufacturing drama, but with the same practical attention she brought to any question of importance. She thought about what she was, which was a woman who had built something real and intended to keep it. She thought about what Frank was, which was a man who had never once in 6 months tried to take anything from her, or make himself necessary to her, or suggest by word or manner that she was less than fully capable of her own life. She thought about the kitchen table conversations and the garden and the surveyor's statement and the specific quality of his attention, which was not the attention of possession, but of genuine interest in the thing she actually was. She thought about Daniel, who had loved her well and whom she had loved well in return, and she understood, standing at her kitchen stove on a cold October morning with the fire going and the smell of coffee in the air, that honoring what she had had with Daniel did not require her to have nothing further. Daniel would have been the first to tell her that, had he been in a position to tell her anything. She was ready. The difficulty was that she had no idea how to indicate this to Frank in a way that was honest without being alarming, because she was not a demonstrative woman, and she had not practiced in the soft and inexact language of beginning something. As it turned out, she did not have to find a complicated way to say it. It was a Thursday evening, the third week of October, and she had made an apple cake from the last of the preserved apples from the root cellar, not because there was any occasion but because she felt like it, which was rare enough to be itself a kind of occasion. She served it at supper, and the general response was enthusiastic. Afterward, when the others had gone and the kitchen was clean and the house had settled into its evening quiet, she cut a second piece onto a plate and carried it upstairs and knocked on Frank's door. He opened it with his book in his hand and looked at the plate with a surprise that he quickly organized into a smile. "Mrs. Hurst." "Louise," she said, "if we are doing that." Something changed in his face. Very quietly but entirely. "Louise," he said. She held out the plate. "I made too much," she said, which was not true and which she suspected he knew was not true. He took the plate. He looked at her for a moment and she looked back, and between them was all the quiet accumulation of 6 months, the conversations and the garden and the books and the coffee and the spaces between words that had slowly filled with something neither of them had named yet. "I have been told," he said carefully, "that I tend to wait too long." "I have been told," she said, "that I tend to close myself up entirely." He nodded slowly. "So perhaps we are both making adjustments." "Perhaps," she agreed. He said, "I think I am falling in love with you. I have thought it for some time, and I believe you ought to know it." The directness of it was so like him, no ceremony, no performance, just the clear statement of a true thing offered for her consideration. She felt it go through her like the first cold morning of autumn, sharp and clean and entirely real. "I know it," she said. "I have not known what to do with it." "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She thought about the right answer and decided there was only one. "I want to let it be what it is," she said. "Which is something I have not let anything be in a very long time." He set the plate of cake on the dresser behind him and stepped forward, and he took her right hand, which still had a faint trace of flour on it from the baking, and held it in both of his the way you hold something you are being careful with, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm and into the sealed space in her chest, which opened, finally, with what she could only describe as relief. "Louise Hurst," he said, "you are the most extraordinary person I have been in a room with in my entire life." "You have been in rooms with a very great variety of people," she said, which was not romantic but which made him laugh, a full, genuine laugh that she had not heard from him before, low and warm and entirely unguarded, and she found herself smiling in return, properly smiling with her whole face. He kissed her then, gently, with both her hands in his, standing in the doorway of his room with the lamp behind him and the hall quiet and dark around them. It was the first time she had been kissed since Daniel, and it was different from what she expected. Not a lessening of Daniel's memory, but a separate and entirely new thing, existing in its own right, which was exactly how it should be. She stepped back after a moment and looked at him. "Good night, Frank," she said. "Good night, Louise," he said, and his voice was different in a way she could not articulate but felt clearly. She went back downstairs and sat in her kitchen in the quiet for a long time, and she did not analyze what she was feeling because for once she did not need to. She knew what she was feeling. It was happiness of the specifically earned variety, and it was good. November came in cold and serious across the Kansas plain, with the kind of wind that found every gap in every wall and made the fires necessary all day long, not just in the evenings. The boarding house became more itself in winter, more contained, more lit from within, the smell of coal smoke and cooking, and the particular warmth of a house inhabited by people who had chosen to be there. Louise and Frank moved into the new territory of their understanding gradually, in the way that two careful people who have already made one mistake each in matters of the heart tend to move with attention and without unnecessary rushing. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room on a Friday evening, which was the nearest thing Caldwell offered to a formal occasion, and she wore the dress she had not worn since the spring of 1876, which fit her differently than it had then but which was still beautiful, and she saw him register it without being able to school his expression entirely, which she found she liked very much. They walked back from the hotel in the cold evening with the stars enormous above the plain, and he offered his arm and she took it, and they walked the 4 blocks to the boarding house in a silence that was full of warmth. The town noticed. Of course it did. Caldwell was not a large place, and Louise Hurst was not an invisible figure in it, and Frank Trask had been a boarder at her house for 7 months, and people began to revise the stories they told about both of them accordingly. Louise received some commentary on the subject from various quarters, some congratulatory, some skeptical, some colored by the particular brand of small-town concern that is indistinguishable from interference. She received all of it with equal equanimity. She had long practice in being the subject of other people's opinions. Garrett Sully made one final attempt in December, which was both his worst move and his last. He came to the boarding house on a Sunday morning while Louise was at the Methodist church and Frank was the only one home, and Sully told Frank, with the particular arrogance of a man who assumes shared understanding between men, that it was a shame to see a decent fellow wasting his time on a woman who was too proud to know what was good for her. Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Sully, I would like to be very clear about something. Louise Hurst is not a problem to be solved or a property to be persuaded. She is a woman of extraordinary intelligence and character who has built something fine out of genuine hardship, and I am honored by her company. If you come to this house again with any intention other than legitimate business, I will make certain Sheriff Alcott has a very detailed account of every interaction you have had with this property over the past 2 years, including the fraudulent boundary appeal, and I will do it in writing with my professional signature on it. Do you understand me?" Sully left. When Louise came home from church and Frank told her what had happened, she stood in the hallway in her good coat with her prayer book in her hand, and she looked at him, and she said, "You did not need to do that." "I know it," he said. "I wanted to." She put the prayer book on the hall table and she stepped forward and she kissed him quickly, firmly, with her own initiative, which was a first and which she could see from his expression was not an unwelcome development. "Thank you," she said. "He will not be back," Frank said. "No," she agreed. "He will not." Sully was, in fact, not back. He sold the Lucky Star to a new investor in January and relocated to Wichita, and Caldwell did not particularly miss him. Christmas came to the boarding house with a quality of warmth that Louise had not orchestrated for herself in several years. She decorated the parlor with greenery and ribbon, which she had done every year out of habit, but this year it felt like something more than habit. Margaret Denny contributed a fruitcake and her good humor. Ernest Poole brought a bottle of actual champagne, which Louise permitted as a Christmas exception to the no-liquor rule, receiving it with the particular graciousness of a woman who knows when the rule serves its purpose and when it does not. Harrison, the school teacher, played carols on the parlor harmonium with surprising skill. Frank carved a small wooden box for Louise out of a piece of walnut he had been working on for 3 weeks in the evenings, which she found in the parlor on Christmas morning with her name written on the paper that wrapped it. And inside the box, lined with blue velvet, was a small silver brooch in the shape of a rose. She put it on immediately, and she kept it on all day, and she touched it once or twice when she thought no one was looking, and Frank was looking every time. January of 1883 was hard in the way Kansas January usually was, with the cold coming down from the north with nothing to stop it but the will of the people it was applied to. Louise ran the house. Frank ran his surveys in the frozen mornings, and in the evenings they talked, and in the evenings the rest of the house seemed to understand that from 7 to 9 the kitchen table was occupied territory and not to be disturbed. They talked about the future, eventually, not in dramatic terms but in the honest and tentative way of two people who have both learned that the future is not guaranteed and must therefore be addressed directly rather than assumed. What do you want?" Louise asked him one January evening, a simple and extraordinary question coming from her, and he understood the weight of it. "I want to stay," he said, "in this town, in this house with you. I want that to become something that has a name if you are willing." She looked at her hands on the table. She had calloused, capable hands, a working woman's hands, and she had never been self-conscious about them, and she was not self-conscious about them now, but she was aware of them in the lamplight. "I have run this house alone for 6 years," she said. "It is mine." "Yes," he said without hesitation or qualifier. "That does not change," she said. "It does not change," he agreed. "And I have my way of doing things," she said. "My rules, my systems. I am not easy to live with, Frank, I know that about myself." "You are not easy," he said. "You are honest and exacting and occasionally formidable, and I find all of those qualities both admirable and entirely compatible with wanting to spend my life near you. The easy thing is not what I am looking for." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me then," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Louise Hurst," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, as if it were the answer to a question she had been holding for a while, which it was. They were married in March, in the Methodist church, on a morning that was cold but bright, with the early light on the plain making everything look freshly made. Margaret Denny stood with Louise, and Ernest Poole stood with Frank, and Cal Whitmore appeared unexpectedly from wherever the winter had taken him, arriving the evening before on a horse that needed rest, and with a grin that needed no explanation. Sheriff Alcott attended, and the school teacher Harrison attended, and a fair portion of Caldwell attended because Louise Hurst getting married was an event that commanded attention, and because Frank Trask had, in the 9 months of his residence, earned the town's general respect without particularly trying to. Louise wore a dress she had made with Margaret's help from blue wool, with her silver rose brooch at the collar, and she walked into the church on no one's arm but her own, which was noted by some and understood by those who knew her, which was that she was not being given to anyone because she was not anyone's to give. She was making a choice freely, with her whole self. The ceremony was simple, and the vows were the ones written in the prayer book, and Louise said them in her clear, direct voice without trembling, and Frank said them looking at her in a way that made Margaret Denny produce a handkerchief from her sleeve. And when it was done, and the preacher told them they were married, Frank leaned down and kissed his wife with a tenderness that was entirely without self-consciousness, and the assembled Caldwell attendees applauded with authentic enthusiasm. The reception was at the boarding house, of course. Where else would it be? And Louise had cooked for 2 days in advance, and the parlor was decorated again with greenery that was supplemented for the occasion with early spring flowers from the first cutting of someone's garden, and the champagne was legitimate this time and plentiful, and even Louise drank a glass of it, and allowed the happiness to show fully on her face for the better part of an afternoon without pulling it back. It was the best day she had had in a very long time. She was aware of this clearly and without qualification, and she was grateful for it. Frank moved his things from room 3 to Louise's bedroom, her room, on the main floor behind the kitchen, the room she had shared with Daniel and then kept alone, and he did it quietly and without drama, fitting his small collection of books onto the shelf where there had been space for years, hanging his jacket on the peg beside hers, and standing in the room with a look of such careful gratitude that she stepped forward and put her hand against his face, and he closed his eyes and leaned into it. And they stood like that in the quiet room for a long moment, 2 people who had each been alone in specific ways, learning what it was to no longer be. The boarding house continued to operate because it was going to continue to operate. This was not a question. Frank had his survey work, which was reliable and which he was good at, and Louise had her house, and the combination of them was a thing that worked with the particular efficiency of 2 capable people who respect each other's capacities. The rules board stayed on the front door. The linens were changed every Thursday. The meals were on time. Nothing about the running of it changed, except that there was a man in Louise's kitchen in the evenings who was her husband, and who helped with the dishes without being asked, and who made her laugh more often than she had laughed in years. Spring came back to Caldwell, and with it, new life of the most direct and particular variety. Louise knew in May. She was 32 years old, and she had been married 2 months, and she stood in her kitchen on a May morning with the certainty of it sitting quietly in her center, and she felt something she had not let herself feel even when she and Daniel had hoped for it, a deep, still happiness that was also a kind of awe. She told Frank that evening plainly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the hour after supper, and she watched his face move through the news surprise, and then something underneath the surprise that was so large and unguarded she felt almost privileged to witness it. He reached across the table for her hands. His eyes were bright in the lamplight. "Louise," he said, and that was all he said for a moment, just her name, and it was enough. "November, I think," she said. "Maybe late October." "Are you well?" he asked immediately with the practical directness she had come to value. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am strong, Frank, I always have been." "You have," he said. Held her hands and looked at her. "We will need to think about arrangements, for when you cannot be running the house quite as I will be running the house," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said with a small smile. "Different arrangements then. Help, Margaret could be asked. Cal will be back from Texas by September." "Margaret already suspects," Louise said. "She has been looking at me with that particular look of hers for 2 weeks." "She loves you," Frank said. "So does Cal in his way. So does Poole, although he expresses it by complaining about the biscuits." "He has never once complained about the biscuits," Louise said. "No," Frank agreed. "He has not," she laughed. He laughed. Outside, the Kansas evening was beginning to fill with the warm sounds of late spring, and inside, in the clean kitchen of the house she had built and held and made into something, Louise Hurst, Louise Trask, though she ran the house under her own name because that name meant something in Caldwell, and she had earned it, sat with her husband's hands in hers and let herself be entirely happy. Summer passed in the fullness of work and warmth, and the slow, beautiful changes of a body doing what it was designed to do. Louise managed the house all the way through July and most of August with her characteristic efficiency, adapting her methods as necessary with a pragmatism that made Frank occasionally want to simply stand back and admire her, which he did, though he was careful not to be obvious about it because she found excessive watching while she worked irritating. Margaret Denny was a consistent and invaluable presence, taking on more of the serving and room preparation as the months progressed, and Cal Whitmore returned from the Texas run in early September, brown as saddle leather and full of trail stories, and he took over the heavier physical tasks, hauling coal, bringing water, the maintenance work that Frank also shared without being asked, and with his usual cheerful energy. Ernest Poole, who had never in 3 years done anything particularly useful around the house beyond paying his rent on time, suddenly, and without explanation, began fixing things. He repaired the loose board on the second stair that had been squeaking since the previous winter. He rehung the back gate. He replaced a cracked pane in the kitchen window with such care and precision that Louise was moved to ask where he had learned to do it, and he told her, slightly embarrassed, that he had been a glazier's apprentice before he went into dry goods. "Why have you never mentioned this?" she asked. "You never seemed to need it," he said. "I always needed it," she said. "I just did it myself." He turned redder and repaired 2 more windows before supper. Frank was present and attentive through the autumn in a way that never tipped into hovering. He had good judgment about when to be near and when to give her space, which she had noticed from the beginning and which she appreciated even more now. He rode out for his survey work, and he came home for dinner, and he sat with her in the evenings, and on the nights when she was tired or uncomfortable, he read to her from whatever book was current, his voice low and steady in the lamplight, and she lay on their bed and listened and thought that this, precisely this, was what she had not known she was missing for 6 years. On the morning of the 28th of October, 1883, as the autumn light was coming gold across the Kansas plain, and the household was beginning to stir toward breakfast, Louise's son was born. He was born in the bedroom behind the kitchen, with Margaret Denny and the town's physician, Dr. Clara Hanson, one of the very few women doctors practicing in the territory, a fact that Louise had sought out with deliberate purpose when she learned she was expecting both present. Frank was in the kitchen because he had been directed to the kitchen with the firm authority of both women, and because he was there when it was over, when Margaret opened the kitchen door with a tremendous and uncharacteristic smile and said, "You have a son." Frank was across the kitchen and through the door before the sentence was entirely finished. Louise lay in the clean bed with the baby against her chest, and she looked up at Frank in the doorway with her hair loose around her shoulders and the new light of new motherhood on her face. And he came to her side and crouched down to see the baby, small and perfect and red-faced and furious at the indignity of being in the world. And he put one careful finger against the baby's tiny fist, and the baby's tiny fist closed around it with surprising force. And Frank looked at that, and then he looked at Louise, and his face was so entirely open that she felt she was seeing all the way to the bottom of him. "He is strong," she said. "Of course he is," Frank said. "Look who his mother is." They named him Daniel James Trask. Daniel for the man who had first made the house possible, whom Louise would always honor, and James for Frank's brother, whose photograph still stood in its leather frame on the dresser, included now in the household rather than set apart. Daniel James Trask turned out to be a baby of strong opinions and healthy lungs, which surprised no one who knew his mother. He also turned out to be curious about everything from the earliest age, which surprised no one who knew his father. He was the first baby the Hurst boarding house had ever contained, and he was received by the household with the kind of collective adoration that transforms a group of more or less separate individuals into something resembling a family. Cal Whitmore, who had no siblings and had never spent any time around infants, became improbably devoted. He spent his evenings off sitting in the parlor with the baby on his knee, narrating things to him in a low, earnest voice: cattle routes, card strategies, the layout of the Texas plains, as if the baby were capable of filing this information for future use. Ernest Poole knitted. This became known gradually and was never made into a thing, but the baby received a pair of wool booties in November and a small blanket in December that were each of high quality, and came from Poole's corner of the parlor by way of Margaret, who had agreed to act as courier to preserve everyone's dignity. Margaret Denny herself became a godmother in everything but formal title, and she and Louise sat together on winter evenings with the baby between them and spoke with the ease of two women who had moved past the careful politeness of landlady and tenant into something older and truer. The boarding house ran. Of course it ran. There were adjustments. There were always adjustments. That was the nature of running anything. But the house adapted around the new life in it the way a healthy thing adapts, making room without losing its essential character. Louise was at the breakfast table by 6:30 every morning, which was 30 minutes later than before, but which she compensated for with an efficiency of method that more than covered the difference. She ran the house, and Frank ran his surveys, and Daniel James Trask grew from a furious, red-faced newborn into an opinionated and delightful small person who walked at 11 months and talked more or less, in the vocabulary available to him, at 13, and who had his mother's brown eyes and his father's capacity for stillness and a smile that was entirely his own. By the spring of 1884, Caldwell had changed somewhat. The cattle trade was already beginning to shift, the railroads extending further into Texas and pulling the commerce south, and the town was in the process of becoming something different from what it had been, as Western towns tended to do. Some businesses closed. Others opened. The boarding house remained what it had always been: full, well-run, and the best place in town to sleep and eat, because the need for a good boarding house did not go away with the cattle. It just served different travelers. Louise had another conversation with Frank about the future in the spring of 1884, a practical one about money and property, and what kind of future they were building. The survey work was reliable but not permanent. The railroad's appetite for new survey work in this particular part of the territory was nearing saturation. Frank had been thinking, he told her, about land of their own. Not to replace the boarding house, that was not and had never been on the table, but land adjacent to the town, a section that was coming available, where he thought there was real potential for a small cattle operation of their own. Not large, 10 or 20 head, managed well, with the possibility of growing gradually. He knew cattle. He had worked them in his years of moving around the West, and he knew the business well enough to know where other people's operations went wrong. Louise listened to all of this at the kitchen table. Their table, the table that had hosted 6 months of careful courtship and 2 years of marriage, and more significant conversations than any other flat surface in Caldwell, Kansas. And she asked the right questions, which were the practical ones about cost and timeline and contingency. And he answered them with the care of a man who had thought it through and knew his wife would not accept anything that had not been thoroughly considered. "We could do it," she said at the end. "I think so," he said. "Together," she said, which was both a condition and a statement. "Together," he agreed. They bought the land that autumn, 20 acres south of town, and Frank began running a small herd the following spring, modestly, and with the methodical care he brought to everything. And it was not a dramatic or a glamorous operation, but it was a real one, and it grew at the pace of things that are built properly from good foundations. The years between 1883 and 1887 formed a life, not a series of events but an actual life, with the texture and continuity and accumulation of lived time. The boarding house was full. The land prospered moderately. Daniel James Trask grew into a boy of remarkable energy and curiosity, who had to be frequently discouraged from following the cattle, and frequently encouraged toward the letters and numbers that Louise was determined he would master. He was 7 in 1890 and could already read with fluency and ride with confidence, and he had his father's way of watching the world with complete attention before he spoke, which Louise found herself grateful for daily because it meant that, when he did speak, he generally had something worth saying. In the summer of 1887, Louise learned she was expecting again. She told Frank in the kitchen on a June morning while Daniel James was asleep in the back room, and Frank's face did the same thing it had done the first time: surprise, and then something underneath it too large to be fully contained. And he pulled her into his arms without ceremony and held her, and she let herself be held, which she was considerably better at than she had once been. This time the child was a girl, born in January of 1888, on a night when the snow was piled up against the boarding house windows, and the Kansas wind was saying things about the nature of winter that did not bear repeating. She arrived with less drama than her brother had, but with no less force of personality, and they named her Clara Rose Trask, Clara for the doctor who had delivered both of them, and Rose for the bush in the garden that bloomed every summer without fail. Clara Rose Trask turned out to be a child of exceptional determination and an early, implacable sense of justice, which her mother found deeply familiar and her father found quietly amusing. She walked at 10 months and talked at 12, and by 18 months had developed a comprehensive system of opinions about how things should be done, that she communicated with complete confidence to anyone within range. Daniel James, age 4 when his sister arrived, received her with the cautious curiosity of a child who is not entirely sure what he is being given but is willing to investigate. He was protective of her from the beginning, not aggressively, not possessively, but with the steady quality of someone who has decided that a thing is worth protecting and will do so without making a show of it. Louise watched this and thought that he was, in this as in several other qualities, entirely his father's son. Ernest Poole, who had finally admitted his knitting hobby without apology after Clara Rose's arrival, produced a blanket of such lavish quality and complexity that Margaret Denny, who could assess these things professionally, declared it a genuine work of craft. Poole accepted this praise by turning red and returning immediately to the dry goods store to avoid further discussion of it. The boarding house changed with the years in the way of everything that endures. Some things were updated, and some things stayed exactly as they had always been, because Louise was not a person who changed what worked, and she knew very precisely what worked. The rules board by the front door was replaced in 1886 with a new board, painted in the same colors, because the original had weathered past legibility, but the rules were identical. The linens were still changed every Thursday. The meals were still served on time. Margaret Denny remained a boarder and a friend through all of it, her presence in the house by now so fundamental it was impossible to imagine the place without her. She had declined 2 very decent offers of courtship in the years since Louise had known her, declining them with the same calm self-knowledge with which Louise had once run the house, the knowledge of what she was and what she required, and the willingness to hold to that even under pressure. She was content. She said so directly, and Louise believed her. Cal Whitmore came and went with the seasons for several years, always returning to room 3, the room Frank had vacated between drives, until the spring of 1886 when he married a girl named Helen from Wellington and settled there, which involved a farewell from the boarding house that was more emotional than anyone, including Cal, had anticipated. He visited with Helen the following summer and the summer after that, and his devotion to the Trask children was ardent and uncomplicated. In the spring of 1889, Louise planted new roses in the garden. The original bush had finally given up in the winter of 1888, having managed 13 good years in Kansas soil, which was longer than most things managed, and Louise dug it out and composted it without ceremony and ordered a new root from a catalog and planted it in the same spot with the same care she had given the first. Frank helped her, crouched in the garden dirt the way he had crouched that first August evening, working on the other side of the row, and they worked in the easy partnership of people who have been doing things together for years and have figured out the rhythm of it. The first one lasted 13 years, he said. I expect this one to last longer, she said. The soil is better now. We have improved it. He looked at her with the particular look she had come to know as the one that was still, after 6 years of marriage, capable of doing something to her chest that surprised her. You improve everything you tend to, he said. Do not be sentimental over the rose planting, she said, but she was smiling. I am absolutely being sentimental over the rose planting, he said pleasantly, and went back to his work. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, before she went back to hers. It was 1890 when Daniel James Trask first rode out with his father on the land south of town, properly riding, not led, not supervised, but actually riding alongside Frank as a capable participant, and Louise watched them go from the kitchen window, her son's small straight back and her husband's larger one side by side against the Kansas morning sky. And she stood with her coffee cup in her hands and felt the fullness of what she had built and what she had been given press against the inside of her chest like summer light against a window. The boarding house was full. The land was running well. The children were healthy and whole. Margaret was in the parlor with her sewing. The rules board was on the front door. The rose bush was establishing itself in the garden, already showing its first year's growth with the confidence of a plant that knows it has been well placed. She had run this place with an iron hand for 15 years iron because softness without structure collapses, and she had learned this at considerable cost and had never forgotten it. But the hand had always had a soft heart behind it, and for 6 years she had let nobody see that. And then Frank Trask had come to her front porch with his hat in his hand, and had read the rules board before he knocked, and everything that followed from that moment had been the most important and illuminating work of her life. She thought about what Margaret had said all those years ago. Running a house and having a life are not mutually exclusive. She had known it when she said it. She had been slow to apply it. She had gotten there. In the summer of 1891, when Clara Rose was 3 and Daniel James was 7, and the boarding house had been running for 15 years, and the rose bush had been replaced and was blooming, and the land was returning a modest and reliable income, Louise Hurst Trask stood in her garden on an evening in August, and her husband came around the corner of the house and found her there, the way he had found her there on that first evening in 1882, and the light was the same. That thick gold Kansas evening light that makes everything look more beautiful than it already is. He stood for a moment looking at her in the garden. She turned and looked at him. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the roses which were in full bloom, a second flush of red against the late summer green. "Beautiful." "They are," she agreed. He put his hand out and she took it, and they stood in the garden in the evening light with the sounds of the house behind them, Margaret's voice in the kitchen talking to someone, Daniel James's footsteps on the upper floor, Clara Rose's particularly decisive small voice carrying from somewhere indoors, and the Kansas plain stretching out beyond the town, and the stars beginning to appear in the deepening sky above it. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question she would not once have permitted herself to be asked, because the answer had been something she could not afford. She permitted it now. "Yes," she said without qualification. "I am." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The rose bush bloomed in the last of the light, red and persisting and entirely alive, and the boarding house stood solid at their back, full of the specific warmth of a well-run place that is also, distinctly and undeniably, a home. The rules board stayed on the front door. The linens were changed every Thursday. Frank Trask rode his land in the mornings and came home in the evenings, and his wife ran her house with an iron hand and a full heart. And the heart was no longer a secret from anyone, least of all from the man who had first seen it clearly, through the kitchen window and the garden gate and the kitchen table and the pages of a borrowed book, and who had waited with the patience of a man who understood that the finest things take time to open, and who had been entirely right. Louise Hurst had built something real out of hardship, and love had come to it the way spring comes to a well-tended garden, not because it was demanded or manufactured, but because the conditions were finally, carefully, exactly right. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.